Hi, we continue in Luke 15 with one of the most famous stories in the Bible, if not the most famous, the story usually known as the parable of the prodigal son, but really the story of a man with two sons, as you can see on the left side of the screen. And I have to admit, although I've done many videos for this Radical Bible program so far, I'm finding myself feeling a little intimidated by entering the story because there's just so much going on, and it's such a beloved story that I don't want to do anything that would damage anybody's love for the story, and I sure hope I wouldn't do that. And yet there are many different angles to approach to understand this, and we need to look at a variety of them to get a picture of the fullness of what Luke has done in this composition. And it's purely a Luke composition as far as we know. This is one of those stories where scholars don't claim there's other sources, although we can argue about whether the first part and the second part are all original. We're not going to do that now. As I'll show you in a minute, it all fits together precisely in the order it's in now as one complete unit. And yet there are many ways to read it, as we'll see. So to situate ourselves, we're coming up the other side of the travel to Jerusalem chiasm here in the pink and blue and yellow parts, and now we're still in this pink part, parallel to what we saw over here. And really, though, more what we're going to see the parallel today is with the story that follows, and I'll show that right now as we look at the one way of shaping this, which is to connect these two stories, the story of the father and the two sons, and the story of the dishonest or the manager of injustice that follows in chapter 16, and I'll show you in a minute about some of the connections there. So we can read this as two stories about economic or relational struggle and restoration, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. This is also being addressed in the presence of the tax collectors and sinners and the Pharisees and scribes that we saw at the beginning of the chapter here, and I was noting with both the sheep parable and the coin parable, we can listen to them addressed to both pairs of groups of listeners and hear them in different ways. And the same kind of thing in our story today. So we'll be listening as if we're hearing that from the perspective of the scribes and the Pharisees, as well as from the perspective of the tax collectors and sinners. I didn't look last time at key words, and there's not a lot to say here because it's rather obvious that in our section here, in this whole unit, the key words are plainly father and sons, and then celebrate, and the question of who will participate in the celebration. So not a lot more to say about that. So let's jump into some of the ways of reading this story. At one level, we can read this as an allegory for Ephraim and Judah as sons. And to understand that, we need to look at a couple of the back passages here. Here's the Jeremiah one that we see here from Jeremiah 31. So, thus says Yahweh, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, says Yahweh. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, says Yahweh. Your children shall come back to their own country. Indeed, I heard Ephraim pleading, you disciplined me, and I took the discipline. I was like a calf untrained. Bring me back. Let me come back, for you are Yahweh, my God. And then farther down, is Ephraim my dear son? Is he the child I delight in? As often as I speak against him, I still remember him. Therefore I am deeply moved for him. I will surely have mercy on him, says Yahweh. And as my note says below, see Hosea. And so let's look at Hosea, and really the whole chapter here is relevant. Let's jump to the end to here. So it ends with, I will return them to their home, says Yahweh. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. So what we're hearing there is that Ephraim is a synonym for Israel, and that's true throughout the prophets. And it really goes back to the story of Joseph in Genesis, where Ephraim is one of Joseph's sons born in Egypt. And there are many scholars who have made connections between our story and Egypt. I'm not going to do that because I can't go down every possible rabbit hole. But simply the question of Ephraim as Israel going to Assyria, and in the 7th century, the 8th century BCE, when Assyria conquered what would become Samaria in 722. And so that's what's at issue here, perhaps, is Samaria. And as we know from the Hebrew Bible, after the exile, the folks in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah rejected the attempts of the former Assyrians to be joined with them in rebuilding the Jerusalem temple. So one of the issues in Jeremiah and Hosea is, the Ezra and Nehemiah people have the perspective that God is really going to reject the former Israelites because they abandoned Judah and Jerusalem, which is understood as abandoning Yahweh, according to the Jerusalem-centered view, or are they going to be reunited? And historically, they were not reunited, but perhaps Luke's Jesus here is suggesting a way to reunite them. So that's one way to hear the story. And that would fit with other stories we hear, especially as we'll hear in chapter 19 about someone else who goes off into another country, and that's plainly a little allegory about Augustus and Herod working out a relationship for Herod to rule over Judea. So we know there are stories like that, and we know also that Luke has had Jesus condemn collective units like Capernaum, as we saw earlier. There's certainly grounding for that version of reading the story. Another way to read it, as you can see, number 2 here, is about the Pharisees and the tax collectors, which makes sense out of the immediate scene. The Pharisees seen as those who follow the rules and have earned a place and are resentful of those who are coming in, namely the tax collectors and sinners, and the tax collectors and sinners plainly as those who've gone astray and yet plead to return. That's certainly one way to read it. Another way, and that's the connection that we can see with the prodigal son and the shrewd manager, which I'll look at in a second, of how the mammon of injustice, which is to say the inheritance that the son gets here, divides people. The desire for it, and we see it divided the property, but it also divided the family, and it's the gift economy. The father providing the robe and the fatted calf for no charge, and the party that restores them. So it could be read as two kinds of economies, the mammon of injustice, or the imperial economy, versus the gift economy, or the economy of the religion of creation. That's another way to read it. And certainly we could not engage the most popular way to read it, and that's Henri Nouwen's engagement with Rembrandt's painting. So popular, Nouwen's book, you can see the cover of Nouwen's book here, that another book was written about the making of Nouwen's book. And the Nouwen Society, Henri Nouwen has since died, but the Nouwen Society has provided discussion questions for Nouwen reading groups around this book, which I'll post on Radical Bible because it's here for public use and they intend it to be used. And so that's certainly another way to read it. And that way to read it is going to go beyond what I can do in this series, and I'm hoping my wife Sue at some point will come along and express something of Nouwen's view of how this is the depth of the spiritual journey. And as Nouwen notes, he's identified in his life with all 3 of the characters in the story, and perhaps we all have too. One way not to read it, and this is the way it has been read through much of history, but we're not going to read it this way because it's just pure anti-Judaism and doesn't fit anything Luke's about, which is to see the Jews as the elder son who follow the law and the Gentiles as the younger son who are greedy pagans, etc. And it's the Gentiles who are welcomed and the Jews who stand outside the door. But there's nothing in the story to suggest that that's the context. And not only that, interestingly, God is not mentioned in the story, and there's nothing openly religious about the story at all. There's no sense of prayer, there's no sense of any kind of religious worship, and there's no mention of God. And so we don't know the ethnic context of it. This could be a story about rich Jewish family, or a rich Roman family, or both, or neither. Just a story that isn't connected to place because no ethnicity or place is mentioned. The fact that there are pigs in the story has led some to hear it as a Jewish-Gentile thing, but pigs were in Gerasa too in Luke 8, and we didn't have to engage that question there. So that doesn't determine it in itself. So lots of ways to read the story. Let's just jump in and see what we can hear. So as we start, Jesus said, and right away I have to note there's no Jesus in the Greek here, it's simply then he said, which highlights it as just continuing from what we saw before. There was a man, and that might not seem like much, but that introduction is one of the links that connects it with chapter 16. So let's look at those parallels right now. Only one other, by the way, is the story of the rich man and Lazarus, who has there was a man, and these 3 connections. So really connecting all 3 of those. So we see here that both have this phrase squandered property, and only in those 2 places. They both follow with a soliloquy that leads to a new plan. And it's not quite metanoia, it's not quite repentance, and scholars acknowledge that, but the prodigal son comes to himself, and the manager said to himself, and they come up with a plan that they hope will restore them to some kind of good life. And then there's an issue about being back in the house, and then there's a question of celebration or commendation. So these are tightly connected stories, and really the story we're on now, the father and the 2 sons, is a bridge between the 2 parables we saw about the lost sheep and the coin, and the question of economics there. So we'll keep all that in mind. So there was a man who had 2 sons, and As my note below says, the suspense is built immediately in the reference to two sons, but the narrative is only one for the first 14 verses, so we don't find out about the other son until much later. Laherd, who I mentioned in the previous video, was listening to the story through the lens of Bible study groups with Arab and Yemeni women. Note here that the Arab women reading the story claim that firstborn sons often have responsibilities that younger sons don't have, and that younger sons are often rebellious, lazy, etc. That's a stereotype, but notice it's a cross-cultural stereotype. And as we can also note, in the Greco-Roman literary tradition, there are also many stories and plays about rebellious younger sons. And of course, people who do work with family of origin and birth order in the modern world could certainly suggest that it's common for the elder son to be the good boy and the younger son to be the one who takes advantage of that and rebels. And ironically, or perhaps not, in my stepfather and my father's family with my stepmother, the two sons were exactly that. The elder son was a good boy who followed all the rules, and the younger son became a Grateful Dead follower and took a lot of drugs. So there you go. So maybe it's true in your family as well. So we hear, the younger of them said to his father. Notice he's named as younger here. It's appropriate, the only other appropriate translation, but the only other use of neoteros here, is for the new wineskins we saw back in 5:37 to 39, which is a passage just before the one about the Pharisees grumbling about him being with tax collectors and sinners. So there's something going on there, and I won't explore it here, but I would encourage you to go back and listen to the video, if you haven't, about the new wine and new wineskins back there to see a connection. So the younger said to his father, and of course father is 12 times in this story, and we'll see it throughout. Dutko, one of the readers I noted in the overview, reads this as the monomyth following Joseph Campbell in his work on mythology, and he notes the archetype of a father gives the story a startling element throughout because of the often anti-archetypal behavior of the father, which is to say, in the myths, the father would chastise the son who goes away or disown him, and yet we know that that's not what happens here. So father in the English is twice, and also in the Greek, twice in a row, emphasizing father, father. The W underscores the relationship that's being violated. As Rohan Park from Korea reads this post-colonially, contrasting Greco-Roman narratives of harsh fathers disciplining rebellious sons with the parable. And so he hears that as coming out of a tradition, a colonial tradition, where fathers rule the roost and keep people in line. So he says, give me the share of the property that will belong to me, in the imperative form, not a request, no please, it's a demand. And I can't tell you how many scholars have spent ink highlighting what an insult this is to the father. It's basically like saying, I wish you were dead. We did hear earlier in 12:13, and we looked at it earlier in the introduction, someone who interrupted Jesus and says, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. And Jesus says at the time, who am I to be judge over you? And he warns him about greed. But this isn't asking somebody else to intervene, and it isn't inviting the brother to participate. It's not asking for the brother's share. It's just saying, give me my share. The phrase share here, meros, is used in the Septuagint as a portion of God's gift to each tribe, but it also has a regular connotation of inheritance. This leads us to need to go back to a passage from Sirach that many scholars have noted, and whether it's the prevailing wisdom is certainly the elite wisdom of the time about how to respond to this. So we hear this. While you are still alive and have breath in you, do not let anyone take your place, this being addressed to fathers. For it is better that your children should ask from you than that you should look to the hand of your sons. Look to the hand of your sons. Excel in all that you do. Bring no stain upon your honor. At the time when you end the days of your life, in the hour of death, distribute your inheritance. So that would certainly be the normal wisdom to do it there, and yet this is not the hour of his death. The word for property here is ousia, and it's used in the Septuagint and Josephus in the sense of land, but it's only here and this next verse in the New Testament. Dual notes that using bios here and ousia in 13 rather than kleros should perhaps dissuade us from understanding the payment as a legal inheritance, and that's what we see here as property as bios. So he asks for the ousia, and he gets the bios here, and there are other ways that this links the story with a seed that fell among thorns, but we're not going to worry about that right now, or this video will be way too long. So what Dual's point is that this is perhaps not the legal property, the legal inheritance, but just giving him some of the property. The term for dividing here is only one other time in the New Testament, but similar to what we saw back in 12:13. So he divided it between them, which implies perhaps that the elder son got his share here, and later we'll hear him say, "All my things are yours," but we don't know that. As below says, the audience would expect the elder son to reject his share in the younger son's request and attempt to reconcile the family on the spot. But as Bailey notes, his silence strongly suggests that his relationship with his father is not what it should be. And we'll see how we could also call this the parable of the dysfunctional family on that regard. So moving on here. As Bailey notes further, the spending of property among Gentiles would have been an offense against the entire community, normally provoking a public ceremony called kisasa, in which the person is ritually cut off from the community. Because as we can see here, and it'll be true in this story and the next story, the younger son's behavior, just like the manager's behavior, dishonors the father or the owner of the property. Certainly, if the son goes off and there's a reputation for being dissolute, that would suggest something bad about the father. So we'll see that as it unfolds. So a few days later, literally after not many days, as Bailey adds, as he goes from one prospective buyer to another, the intensity of the community hatred and disgust mounts. Thus, even though in the Middle East the sale of property ordinarily drags on for a month, the prodigal finished in a hurry and left. The phrase here for gathered all his property, as Marshall notes, has the sense of turning it into cash rather than gathering it together. And we'll see that is similar to what we saw in the landowner, the rich landowner, whose land produced abundantly, but of course the producing abundantly isn't of any good in itself. It has to be turned into cash so he can eat, drink, and be merry, as he planned to do in his soliloquy. So he gathered, it turned into cash all that he had, and he traveled to a distant country, using a word only one other time in Luke, and we'll see the connection to it there. The phrase for distant country here, koran makron, and echoed at 1912. Let's look at that briefly here, so we can see in this one, he said, a nobleman went to a distant country to get royal power. And when we get to that story, I'll show how it's plainly meant to be a thinly veiled allegory about Herod getting power from Rome. And so a distant country there is plainly Rome. Perhaps a distant country here is meant to be Assyria, within the allegory of Ephraim and Judah that I was suggesting. And there he squandered his property, which a term that literally means to scatter seeds. And Duell notes a previous writer, Callan, surveying the motif of an adolescent wasting his father's money on women, common in Greco-Roman literature. But others have suggested that we might take this literally as scattering seed, as an agricultural scattering as well, but most scholars have not taken it that way. He squandered it in what's called translated dissolute living here, sosas zao here, and the word for dissolute is only here in the Bible. Bailey notes it's noteworthily not condemned as immoral, as in gambling or whoring, but simply as wasteful. So quickly it's all gone. So when he had spent everything, using another word that's only here in Luke, a severe famine took place. Now that famine recalls what we heard back in 425 when Jesus gave an inaugural sermon, and the crowd began to resist when he told them that he was not going to favor Nazareth but go to other cities as well, and they wanted to throw him over the cliff. And as one of the examples, he used Elijah caring for a widow who was a foreigner. And so it's already linked to that story by the use of bios there. So a couple of things to connect us with Elijah's care for a widow in the context of a famine. But again, I won't trace down every possible thread. And he began to be in need, using a word only one other time. If we can hear this in contrast to the disciples who are on mission, it will be told in 22:35, are not lacking, despite the absence of possessions. So here the suggestion is the son lacks the social network that provides hospitality, exactly what Jesus sent them out earlier, both the 12 and the 70, to establish, to be welcomed by people and to offer the good news to them in exchange for lodging and food. So he has no social network, and whether it's because his reputation precedes him or he just doesn't know anybody, we can't tell. But now he's alone and in need. So he went out and hired himself, or literally glued himself, as Philip does to the Ethiopian eunuch's chariot in Acts. So it's not a matter of hiring in the sense of establishing a wage, but just connecting himself to one of the citizens of that country. And the word for citizens, polites, certainly makes it political, and it's connected again to the story in chapter 19. So another way to suggest this could be read as a collective story rather than an independent story about individuals. Although, again, there's no reason to exclude one versus another. So he attached himself to have some connection to someone of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. And it's interesting, there are many artistic portrayals of the prodigal amongst the pigs. Here's a couple. This one from Michel Corneille from the 17th century, and here's another one from Albrecht Dürer from the 15th century, and there are many more you can see for yourself. Many people have felt inspired to show this desperate moment of the young man alone amongst the pigs in the field. And the field here is agros, the word for cultivated land. It's similar to what we saw in 8, where the pigs in Gerasa were, so we can listen to that story in connection with it, although the pigs really are not much of a character in the story here. The word to feed, Bosco, also connects with that, feeding the pigs there. So many connections. Wendland, writing from an African perspective, notes in Africa, pigs would forage for themselves, so they wouldn't need people to feed them. And notice there's a connection here with the shepherd and the sheep in the previous one, and out here with pigs being fed in this one. So we come to the end of what we're going to look at today, and as Park, again writing from a Korean perspective, notes, post-colonial perspective, the portrayal of the sons as human animal and son slave, which we'll see with the elder later, unveil a systematic construction of power that does not legitimize full humanity or affirm human capability and agency, which is to say either son is portrayed as fully human. The younger one is being portrayed amongst the pigs, and the elder one characterizes himself as a slave. So both of them will need to be restored. And he would gladly have filled himself, or longed to be filled, as Marshall notes, the nadir of degradation for a Jew to eat what the pigs eat. But of course he's not eating pigs, so some have disagreed with that. But the pods here are carob pods. And Bailey distinguishes two kinds of carob pods, a sweet carob eaten by many as a treat, and a thorny bush carob with black bitter berries, which pigs root, but which can be eaten which can be eaten though without satisfaction by humans, which is very close parallel to the fake fig tree that Zacchaeus climbs up in 1904, that looks like figs from a distance, but up close also offers small bitter fruit. So another interesting connection there. And as the rabbis say about the pods here, when the Israelites are reduced to eating carob pods, then they repent. And he's reduced to wanting to eat that, but he doesn't get any. Possibly because of the famine, that people are so hungry that they're all eating the carob pods. So now he's reached bottom, as we might say. Time for him to sign up for a 12-step program. We'll see what he does in the next video. See you then next time.